was kind of interesting how this came about. I was at the barber shop one day and somebody said to me, John, you're going to be on the program next month. And I said, I am? What program is that? Oh, the Historical Society. Yeah, you're going to be on the program. We're going to be talking about old-time Verona and some of the old characters and so on. I said, interesting. And about a week or so later, someone else ran into me and said, John, you're going to be on the program. And I said, no, I am. I had heard that before. And then, fortunately, Ruth called me and said, John, we'd like to have you on the program. Have you heard from anybody about this? And I said, no. And so, even though I came today, I wasn't really sure if somebody else might still be going to be on the program. But here I am. I'm going to, as they requested, I'm going to talk a little bit about old-time Verona and some of the characters that I remember. The article that was in the Verona Press is a little misleading because it said that I'm working on a book, and some of you know that book's been around for about 3 years. I'm just curious, and that's all, to ask how many of you here have read the book Down at the Nest? Well, that's good. Pretty good. Thank you. Pardon me? Oh, thanks, Doreen. She was my teacher in high school, you know, and our advisor. She says stuff like that, but I don't know if it means that much. Anyway, most of what I'm going to say, I have to set a stage, I think, a little bit for what Verona was, which took me into doing Down at the Nest. Probably in the book you'll notice the characters that are portrayed there, most of them drank too much. Not all of them, though, however. And but taverns were an important factor in the book, and there were, believe it or not, 6 taverns in Verona back in the late 30s and in the 40s. This is primarily the time frame when all of my articles started to come together. There was the auditorium, which is now Cahoots, was the doghouse, and was the Broken Spur. There was Petrosky's Tavern, which later became the Town Pump. There was Fischel's Tavern and Bowling Alley. There was the Eagle's Nest, which was down in the corner of the main intersection. And there was the Dugout, or Cress's Tavern, which was actually in the town of Verona. And there was Heckman's Tavern. Some of you probably don't remember that. It was a big 2-story house that's right across the street from St. Andrew's Church. And one of the pictures that you got from the Wildcat shows a group, I think a bicycle club, and a picture of them outside of Heckman's Tavern. And so that was also in the town of Verona. Town of Verona ended right there where the old library used to be. That was the town and the city, or the village limits. In Verona at that time, just get a load of this. There were 500 people. There were 4 grocery stores. There was 1 locker plant, meat processing and grocery store, 1 hardware store, 1 harness shop, 4 churches, 1 blacksmith shop, 1 lumber yard, 1 train depot, 1 motel, 5 filling stations, 2 doctors, 1 dentist, 1 undertaker, a furniture and paint store, which he also ran, 1 bowling alley, 1 bank, 1 post office, 2 restaurants, 1 veterinarian, 1 cigar maker, and 1 Chevy garage and dealership. Interesting, huh? And in this town, taverns were a kind of a major place for a lot of our folks. And since I grew up in the Eagle's Nest, which is pictured here, by the way, that picture is an original painting by an artist by the name of John Warren, who did that painting for the Ford Times magazine. In 1962, the Eagle's Nest was featured as one of the top restaurants in the upper Midwest, and he came and painted that picture in the wintertime, and so I brought it along. Also, Ford Times published a magazine once a month, and the restaurant was featured in the magazine, and then at the end of the year, they had a Ford Times treasury of favorite recipes and famous restaurants, which the Eagle's Nest is featured in. This was done in 1962. Back in those days, the Eagle's Nest was a bit of a dichotomy, I guess I would say. During the daylight hours from 7:30 in the morning until 5 o'clock, it was a local downtown tavern. At 5 o'clock, it became a supper club. Not just a supper club, but a pretty exclusive supper club with quite a reputation. It had a menu much like the menus of downtown restaurants like the Huffman House and the Simon House and Frenchie's and Roadie's. Remember some of those names? And waitresses all wore white uniforms. The tables were dolled up with linen tablecloths and napkins, fresh flowers on the tables and candles, and a relish tray, and the bartenders wore white shirts and bow ties. And so at 5 o'clock, any of the characters in Verona that were still there were ushered out the door. My father saw to that.
And your mom made the best of coleslaw, and her fish, her walleye fish, and her steaks were just super, super.
That's true.
Her pies too. Oh, she made the best pies.
We had a no-menu restaurant. It was very select in that it served only fried chicken, T-bone steak, tenderloin steak, and on Fridays, a walleye dinner at the price of $1.75, which included dessert and coffee. T-bones were $4, tenderloins were $3.75, and chicken was $1.75. Remember those prices even. Well, around town we had some interesting characters. One of the first was a man by the name of Ed Westfall. Anybody remember Ed Westfall? I have taken a waiver from his granddaughter, who is in town nowadays, because I wanted her to know that anything I wrote in my book about him was true, but it was not meant to be demeaning. And she accepted that. He was an interesting character in that he was a bricklayer and stonemason. There's a house on West Lawn Avenue, Land and Stone House, which is a representative of his kind of work. He probably built all the chimneys in the areas of Marietta, Schumann, west of East Verona Avenue over the years. He was a man who had a family, but alcohol was his problem. But he was a good man, and he was a hard-working man. At 7:30 in the morning, I would be swamping out the bar room with mop and pail, and 7:30 he would tap on the door, and he would be looking for a beer and a shot. And then he would buy a half pint, and off he would go to work. And at noon he would be back for a couple of beers and a couple of shots, and spear a sausage out of one of the jars on the bar. You remember some of those? And that was his lunch, and away he would go again. He had a brother, Otto, who was very much the same. He was also a contractor of sorts. And Ed was a regular at all of the bars in Verona. And it was a kind of a sad situation for him, but he seemed to enjoy life pretty well. And eventually he had diabetes. He lost both of his legs, and as that happens, and that was what happened with poor Ed. Foxy Hendricks was our undertaker in Verona. His name was Walter. Thanks, Don. It skipped me for a minute there. Don knows all this stuff. Walter Hendricks, Foxy we called him, and I don't know why. But he was an interesting guy. He imbibed quite freely with ginger brandy was his drink. I served him many times. He, when he got a body, when he had a funeral, he didn't drink. For the 3 days or 4 days of that time, he was totally sober. But as soon as the funeral was over, he was back to ginger brandy. He had a big square, late 30s, probably a Dodge or Buick car. And it was kind of extra long, and it had jump seats in it so that when he went to the cemetery after the funeral, he could take all the pallbearers with him. And once he came back from the funeral, he changed clothes and he was back at Fischel's Tavern or the Town Pump or wherever. Excuse me. The next guy that was kind of a popular guy in town was Grubber Meyer. His name was Gottlieb. He was also known as Horse Meyer. And he traveled to town in a horse and buggy. He lived on Midtown Road. He was a guy that blew stumps for farmers, or big rocks or boulders when they were clearing their land to get more acreage. And he came to town pretty regular with his horse and buggy, and we had horse rails on some of the stores. In fact, the Miller's store had one in front of their store, and there were 2 or 3 others, and his horse would be parked out in front of the Petrusky's Tavern, then the Town Pump. And every once in a while somebody would come out of the bar, unstrap the horse, give it a slap on the back, and it would run right down to Fischel's Tavern. Because that was his next stop. And poor Horsemeyer had an ignominious end. But before that, he was also known as Horsemeyer because we had a mink farm just out of town on 9 Mound Road. And to feed the mink, they used to butcher horses, grind them up. And Horsemeyer was from Europe. He was an immigrant, and they were it was common for them to eat horse meat. And so he used to go out there and pick up some choice pieces for his own menu. And so that was one of the other reasons he was called Horsemeyer. Many times he would be back at home at his little house on Midtown Road, which was a cement block building, much like a double garage. And because he had been inebriated so bad the night before, sometimes he'd still be sitting in the buggy and the horse was still attached. And he hadn't even gotten out of the buggy to go to bed. So he was an interesting character.
John,
Yeah.
we forget to tell that when it came time to go home, why the horse was just taking home.
Yeah, the horse didn't need to be driven. When he left, he would stop sometimes at the Eagle's Nest, but by the time he did, it was usually 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and or later. And my dad would usually meet him at the door, turn him around, and get him in the buggy, and slap the horse, and he would take him home. He didn't need to drive the horse at all. We had 2 characters in town by the name of Willie and Weber. They were immigrants from Switzerland, and they knew very little English, spoke Swiss. One of the reasons I knew a lot about those guys is because my mother talked Swiss, and they would come down to the Eagle's Nest a lot because they wanted to talk to somebody they could talk to. And so they swept floors at the auditorium and at the town pump. And of all things, they lived in a truck box right behind the Secor plant, which is on Lincoln Avenue or Lincoln Street. It was down in that no man's land, kind of to speak, and lived in an old truck box. No electricity, no water, no bathroom. And they were kind of interesting guys. Both of them died here in Verona in later years. Not too much later, by the way. But they were kind of interesting characters in downtown Verona. I should mention Doc Sharp. Most of you remember Doc Sharp's house. It became Hardee's, yeah, it became a Hardee's. Oh, it was a popular move in our town. Yeah, but Doc Sharp was one of the 2 doctors we had in town. And he had quite a bit of that whole block behind where Don Stewart lived and grew up, and had a kind of a stable or a horse barn where he kept his horses before he had a car. As I remember, he had a big black Buick when he pulled out with his wife, always dressed in black. It was kind of interesting. But one time we had by the way, we had a jail too in Verona at the village hall, which was also housed the fire truck. And we had 2 jail cells. And one time there was a man in the jail cell, our Constable Bill Lumpke, who was also our city service man. Had this fellow in jail, probably because of the fact that he had been drunk. Doc went to visit him because they said he was pretty sick. Supposedly he gave him a shot, and in the morning he was dead. Doesn't say much for Doc Sharp. But that was an interesting place. When my folks used to have lunches served at noon, which was way back in the early 40s, whenever we had pig hocks and sauerkraut for the noon special, the 50 It was called What's on the 50, 50 cents. I would have to take a tray of pig ox and sauerkraut over to Doc Sharp and his wife. Take it into the back room, and I'd get a 10-cent tip, and that was really a big day for me. Another kind of an interesting character that wasn't from Verona, but he was from Mount Horeb. Before that, I'll tell you about Norm Guild. Norm was a contractor, and he lived in he and his wife lived on an apartment, and that old apartment house is still there next to Quick Trip. And I think he built 3 houses for his wife, but they never moved in. Every time he'd finish, he had to pay off his debts. But Norm was a drinker, and his wife put him on the blacklist. Anybody know about the blacklist? Those days, if somebody drank too much and they wanted nobody to serve them in town, they went to the village fathers and got a certificate, which was published in the tavern, put in a frame behind the bar, and if you were on the blacklist, you couldn't be served. He had a couple guys that worked for him. One time, one of the guys came in and wanted a pint of whiskey. My dad said, "It's for Norm, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah," he couldn't lie. Well, he said, "Then I can't sell it to you." Well, the guy says, "I'll drink it myself." So he got it. The other guy I want to tell you about is a guy by the name of Ole Olson from Mount Horeb. That was his name. He used to take the bus to Verona because he was on the blacklist in Mount Horeb. And he would drink in Verona until he was inebriated. And he'd always end up down at the Eagle's Nest because the bus, the Greyhound bus that goes to Mount Horeb, stopped across the street at the old Phillips 66 station. And sometimes the bus driver would take him and sometimes he wouldn't. And so my dad sometimes tried to arrange rides for him back to Mount Horeb. You probably don't remember Herman Alt, but maybe you do. Herman was an interesting character. He he lived out in the woods at Bergenski's farm. Now that would be, for those of you who don't know, just up on the top of the hill where Melody Lane is, and off to the left, there was a woods back there, and Herman had a little old trailer back there, and that's where he lived. He did fencing for farmers. That was his primary occupation. He drank port wine and lots of it. He would come to town with a white bag over his shoulder and go back home with groceries and a half-gallon of white port wine. Sometimes when he came to the Eagle's Nest, he was already pretty far gone, and my dad would say, "Take Herman home." And so I would drive him out there, and he would crawl over the fence, back into the woods, and that's where he lived. No electricity, no water, and no bathroom. Yeah, I'm having a little congestion here.
Put a little gin in here, John.
He was drafted into the Army, believe it or not, during World War II. And he served about 90 days. And then the Army must have finally figured out, man, this guy is not for the Army. And so he came home. But in the process of 90 days, he learned the manual of arms. He learned how to march. He used to show that off sometimes in the bar. I remember one time, more than one time, he would be at Fischel's, and the boys that were coming back from service at new manual of arms would put him through the whole thing. He would be using a broom, and they would march him from Fischel's down to the Eagle's Nest. The guys at the Eagle's Nest would march him back to Fischel's, and it was kind of fun. And one day at a parade, Memorial Day parade, the Verona band was marching down Main Street, and into the ranks, you guessed it, was Herman. So he learned a lot in the Army. Herman had an ignominious end. He went to the county farm to live his last days. And on one of his trips to Verona for drinks, and on his way back, he didn't make it, and they found him froze to death. Would be right near where Carl Culver's is right now. And my last character is Dean Brost. You probably all remember Dean. Dean, for those of you who don't know, was a developmentally challenged man. His dad, Ed, was a Raleigh salesman. You all remember Raleigh products? They sell everything from soup to nuts, you know. Ed, I got to tell you about Ed. Mr. Raleigh, who was the president, chairman of the company, he determined that as World War II was coming along, that pepper was going to be hard to find. And they sold a lot of spices. They sold perfume for the ladies. They sold pots and pans, brushes, whatever. And he bought up all of the pepper that he could find from Southeast Asia when he saw that Japan was starting to take over things down there and there wouldn't be any pepper. And he was right. And old Ed got big bags of pepper in the bulk. And I can still remember him filling little round bags with pepper that he sold to customers for 10 cents. But it got him in the door. And if you got Ed in the door, you were going to buy some products from him. So that was important for him. But talking about Dean, he traipsed around Verona. He picked up trash. He picked up cans. He picked up a few coins here and there. He lived with his mother, Mame, and she used to send him to the store with a note for groceries with some money, or send him to the bank to get some money or to make some transaction. And one day Dean went to the bank, and just as he was getting there, the Brinks men were delivering cash to the bank. One guy's walking in with the bundles of cash, and the guy behind him is walking there with his revolver and his hand on the revolver. And Dean walked up behind the man with the revolver, stuck his finger in his back and said, "Stick him up." Well, the man wheeled around and put him up against the wall, and with that, John Shunk and Al Miller came rushing out because they knew it was Dean. And it was not a big problem, but to the Brinks men, it was a serious problem. And so they herded him into a private office, called the police. Police came and found out what the situation was and told Dean never to do that again. And Dean was on his way. The last thing about that was that Dean's mother, who was then pretty old, eventually died. They lived on North Franklin Street. And this was a traumatic thing for Dean. And his family came and they realized that they would have to do something about Dean, where he was going to go, because he couldn't live by himself. And so most of the family went looking for a place, and young Ed Roast, the youngest son, stayed with Dean. And they came back and they had found a place. I cannot tell you where it was. I don't remember where it was. But at any rate, this was on a Thursday, and on Friday, Dean's situation became more serious. He seemed to be ailing. He was having trouble breathing. He was having trouble walking. And on Saturday, he died. And so they had a dual visitation on Monday for Dean and his mother, and the two of them were buried from St. Andrew's Church on Tuesday. Interesting that it worked out that way. Well, those are most of the characters I could think of. Some from my book and some others that weren't in the book. But Verona was, in fact, an interesting place in the 30s and 40s. Remember, we were coming out of the Great Depression, and a lot of the people that were involved in those days were pretty strapped. And that had a lot to do, I think, with the condition of people's lives. And we see that in some of the characters that I portray here. And other than that, I just say if anybody has any questions about any of them, why, you're welcome, but I don't want to extend the time beyond.
Yes, when Dean Roast passed away, I just remember there was a garage full of baseballs and softballs and things that he collected as he walked around town.
Yeah, after every fireman's picnic or hometown celebration or whatever, Dean was the first one on the property looking for whatever might be of value, coins or cans or whatever. Yeah, and he picked up, he went to all the away hometown games with me. He was always at hometown baseball games, but the away games, he would be across the street when I'd get back from church, and that would be like 10:30 in the morning, and we weren't going to be leaving until probably 11:30, 12 o'clock. But he would sit over there on the curb and wait until I was dressed for the game and came out, and I would take him to all the games for quite a number of years. Yeah. Lordy, did you have a question?
We had insulated boxes that we put the milk in when we
Yeah.
delivered milk when my dad had a dairy, and there was one of those in the garage at Frost when we had an auction.
Yeah.
And his son gave it to me. But I was going to ask you, how many years did your mother and dad have the Eagles Nest?
30 years.
Oh, yeah.
She asked how many years my parents had the Eagles Nest. 30 years. We came to Verona in 1936, and they retired in 1966. Then after they retired, Jerry Hunt and his wife Carol leased the premises for 2 years. In the meantime, Mobil Oil Company was talking seriously with my parents about buying the property because they wanted to expand the Mobil station. And they eventually did sell to Mobil, and in 1970, then the Eagles Nest was torn down, and then they expanded the Mobil station. So they were there, 30 years. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment about your mother and her pies. She made the best pie. And a year ago, we had some friends traveling into Verona, and they called me and they asked me where they could stop to get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. Nowhere in Verona could they stop and get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. It's not available to
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? Yeah, one of the things that we've always said is, when are we ever gonna get a nice family restaurant with breakfast, you know? For some reason, it just never happens here. We get a lot of fast food restaurants, but nothing like that. Yeah, my mother probably made, on the average, 5 to 7 pies every day. And, yeah, I can mention something about that. She made I wouldn't call it coleslaw, she made a cabbage salad that was very popular, and it was hand chopped. And that was one of the features of her meal. She baked her own rolls, made her own pies. She fried her chicken, browned her chicken, then she steamed it till it was all done. And then as orders came in, she would fry it again, all in lard. The pies were all made with lard, by the way. The French fries were fried in lard. Who'd ever heard of that today, huh? But everything was homemade. Yeah.
I know they made everything from scratch, because I know my Aunt Lorna helped her in the kitchen.
Yeah. Lorna was
Potatoes and things like that.
That's right. Lorna was she worked for my mother for a number of years. Yeah. Her ace waitress, I guess, first waitress was B. Stomfel. Worked there for many, many years. Ann Vollenweider, a long time.
In fact, when I was a little boy, the big news one morning was somebody had broken into Reverend Paulson's store during the night. And they wondered who did this. They went through a basement window. And it was all hushed up the next day. It was, what's the name of it? Berkeley,
Give me a clue.
Westfall?
Westfall.
Oh, it was
It was out in West, out Westfall and Ed Westfall.
Oh.
And their wives
Huh?
were out partying, and they thought it was a good thing to break into the store. So the next morning when they sobered up, they probably realized what they'd done. And when they admitted it, so it was all hushed up. That's the last they ever heard of it.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, anybody else? Yeah, Ken?
I know that you worked there, but did your sister work there?
My sister, Sue, she worked there. We all had to work there. Yeah, she waited on table. I waited on table, tended bar. I was tending bar at about 17 years old. If your parents had the license and you lived in the building, you know, I could work behind the bar without a license. In fact, I never did have a bartender's license. Never did have. I didn't need one because I didn't work anywhere else. But yeah, she worked there. She washed dishes in the dish tank, just like all of us. And whenever they got real busy, why, we were called on.
Did Walter Graham run the main cafe between your place and Fischel's Bowling Alley?
Yeah, he did.
Then they'd always close at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 until 2, something like that.
Yeah, Walter Graham had a restaurant next
And then
door.
they moved to Evansville when he
Yeah.
quit.
Yeah. I forgot to mention, Walter Hendrick's funeral parlor would have been in the building where Avanti's is, and it would have been the part that is really the bar room. If you've been in there. There was a wall between there, and it was a real narrow. It was like Dodge City, Kansas, believe me. It was pretty primitive, that funeral parlor whole setup. It wasn't first class, believe me.
had doings at your place, you could go and get the wooden chairs from him. He had all these
Yeah.
folded wooden chairs if you were gonna have a celebration.
That's
If
true.
you needed chairs, you could go get them from
You
Walmart.
could get it from Walter, that's right.
Yeah, you mentioned
Okay.
Walter, when I put the records from the cemetery, on the computer, Walter's records were the best records to work with that I had. I had the cemetery records, I had records from 3 different places, but Walter's, everything was just what you wanted.
Well, the reason for that, Art, was because he did all that record work during those days when he wasn't
He
drinking.
was sober.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so good. Bill?
Ed Westfall. The house where I grew up
Uh-huh.
was built in 1928. And he poured the floor in the basement. And I can remember my dad telling that he didn't use a straight line or anything, but that floor, and I can attest to it, that was 3 rooms, that thing all drained to that floor drain. There wasn't a puddle anyplace
Yeah.
in that floor.
Yeah, they always said that Ed had an eye that was unbelievable, that he didn't use a straight line, even when he did a brick wall or anything of that kind. He just was a natural. Yeah, he was a real craftsman.
It's amazing when you're drinking
I know,
to keep things straight.
yeah. Well, that's maybe was his secret.
He couldn't do it sober.
Okay, well, I think that's enough. I'll